Well, hello, and thank you for asking me to come speak with you in this highly mediated manner. The title of my talk is Media Ecology as an Approach to Understanding the Human Condition, which is very close to the title of my book, Media Ecology, an approach to understanding the human condition. So I'm basically going to talk about this book, and I hope that at least if you find what I have to say of interest, that you will go ahead and actually read the book and or purchase the book. One or the other would be fine. And the term media ecology was formally introduced by Neil Postman in 1968, and he introduced it as a field of inquiry. We might say a field of study, but there's something significant about that idea of a field of inquiry, and one that he defined as the study of media as environments. And I find that to be the definition that is the one that I like to work with. I find that it's the most useful one. It's very open-ended, certainly, but it also strikes the right balance, because that's really the key point that we are looking at. This is a study of media, but it's also a particular way of studying media, and that's where why I decided to refer to it in this book as an approach. It's a way of doing things, a way of looking at things. I want to note that one of the differences between media ecology and other approaches to studying media is not just in the approach itself, but in the way that we define media. Um, there are many different ways of defining media within media ecology, and there are differences between the way one scholar may define it and another. But as a field, media ecology allows for a much broader definition of media than you would find in any other field of study. So I think that's really important to understand. And of course, the key definition is that a medium is an environment. And I have also taken from Hannah Arendt the notion of human condition, because that's also another way of speaking of the environment, the conditions that we are subject to and that we live under, and that in turn condition us. The conditions that we create and that we alter, in turn, we are conditioned by. And when we talk about that, should not limit ourselves to what is outside of ourselves, because that's, the environment is whatever is other than whatever it is we're looking at. So it depends on what we're looking at. We talk about the human condition. It also refers to our own biology, our own insides, as well as outsides. So that is also part of what we're looking at. And in a very broad way, then, we could look at or refer to three kinds of environments, three kinds of human conditions, if you like, or areas that we're conditioned by, and in this sense, three kinds of media, three very broad categories of media, beginning with what sometimes would be referred to as the natural, but we could also call it the biophysical, to be more formal and neutral about it. The biophysical environment, that is the environment that scientists study, the environment that encompasses physics and chemistry and biology. And within that environment, we have a second environment that we could call the technological environment, the technological condition. And that really refers to all the different ways that we interact with and modify our environment. So it certainly includes all of our tools and machines and gadgets, also our buildings, our dwellings, our settlements and cities, all of that sort of thing as well. But ultimately, technology boils down to the ways that we act on our environment, and certainly it's become clear, really going back to the 50s, as early as the 50s, that um, we are not the only form of life that employs technology, and we can see technology existing very, very much throughout the animal world. So I would kind of trace it back to the basic idea that all forms of life, just by the very fact of their existence through metabolism, through reproduction, they change, they alter their environment, hopefully to make it more survivable, but in any event, they alter their environment, and that's the essence of technology. So there is the technological environment within the biophysical environment, and of course, the technological environment influences the biophysical environment, just as the biophysical environment influences the technological environment. And within that, there is a third that we would call the symbolic environment. And this is more or less confined to the human species, where we talk about language in particular and other forms of symbolic coding, symbolic form. And of course, this is not separate and apart from our biophysical condition, because language is encoded in us just as technology is. It's part of our genetic heritage, it's part of our physiology, and it's part of our brain structure. So it's not independent of either the biophysical or the technological environment, because language is a kind of tool, symbols are a kind of tool as well. So those are the three main kinds of environments, three kinds of conditions that we're in, three kinds of media that we're subject to, or that we are involved with. And so when we talk about a medium, and one of the things that we're often criticizing is the idea of looking at a medium or of communication as a form of transportation or transmission. That kind of linear model that's associated with Shannon Weaver and really all subsequent models. I mean, no matter how complicated and they get, you're always seeing arrows indicating messages being sent from one point to another point. And we can look at media that way. That's not a problem. It's not wrong to look at it that way, but that's a special case. And in general, we want to think about a media as an environment. So it's something that surrounds us, that we enter into, that we are immersed in. Medium can be a link between 2 points, but it also can be the entire network, or it can be the entire system, or again, the entire situation or context that we're talking about. And when we think about medium as an environment, there are many ways that this can play out. When you think about television, for example, I mean, here I am on video. The screen is an environment for me appearing on the screen. Let me out, right? I mean, I'm inside this environment. We're also all surrounded by signals, by broadcast and satellite and Wi-Fi signals, and surrounded by wires and cables. It changes the architecture of our environment. Certainly television changed the layout and architecture of houses, of homes, and the furniture, and it changes the way waiting rooms and airplanes and taxis are set up. And also there's a sense in which any medium, once it becomes, or any technology becomes part of routine, anything that's routine fades from our awareness. It's not that it's invisible, but it fades into the background. You just don't pay attention to it. We only pay attention to the content of the medium or the use of the technology, and not the technology itself. And in this sense, it becomes environmental and part of our invisible environment. Of course, for say when we talk about television and other screens, they are a window on the world, so that our view of the world is influenced and shaped by the things we see on the screen. So in that sense, it also influences our perceived environment. We encounter our environment mediated by screens, by television and other media. In doing so, it also alters much of our social and cultural environment all around us. And that's true even if you don't have any of the technology yourself. You can not have television, not have a computer, but you can't live in a world without these things, and they have changed our environment drastically. So there are many ways. These are just some of the ways that we can understand media as environment. So that's kind of the ruling metaphor. When we talk about a media ecology utilizing a much wider array of possibilities for how we understand media, or what we mean by media. This includes a number of things. Certainly mass media, also the media of interpersonal communication, like the telephone, and the new media, the social media, mobile media, all of that stuff, of course. But also media as substances and sensations. So when you talk, there's a very old tradition of speaking of a medium as the substance through which we perceive. So for example, if you're seeing me, you're hearing me, and this is through the medium of air, and for vision through the medium of light as well. So there is also the substance that conveys sound, whether it's air or water or, say, wood. These become media as well. We can broaden this out into anything that extends the senses then, so eyeglasses, hearing aids, microscope, telescope, all of these things are instruments, thermometer, stethoscope, instruments extending our sensory organs, but also all forms of artist materials. So, if we talk about a musical instrument, we talk about canvas and oil paints, or watercolors, or the medium of the sculptor being, chisel and stone, or wood and carving tools. Writing surfaces, which Harold Innis pointed to, and the heavy media, light media, the difference between clay tablets and papyrus as writing surfaces in the ancient world. But we also go so far as to include language. Words are a medium. Different languages are different media, but language in general as well, as well as different languages and different other forms of codes or symbolic form, really any kind of form. And in this sense, we're not just materialities of communication, as they refer to over in Europe, but we're concerned both with the material substance, as significant, but also the form or pattern or structure of what we're using as significant as well. Semiotics, we can see this through media ecology, and the icon, index, and symbol as different media. Also the signifier. So we can really stretch this across all different forms of form. And when we go back to the physicality of this, it's also the body itself. I mean, each of the senses, the eyes, the ears, are sort of natural, if you like, or biological media. The body as a medium as a whole, specifically the brain, the nervous system, or the body in its entirety. Certainly dancers would tell you the body is a medium of communication, as an artist medium. This then extends to interaction between people, organization and communication between people, so organizational structures, hierarchies and bureaucracies are media as well, organizations as media. For Mumford, Lewis Mumford made the point that organized human labor was the first machine, and only later did the fallible human parts were they replaced by more reliable non-human mechanical parts. So any kind of relationship is also understood as a medium, so that a parent-child relationship is a medium through which the two, parents and children communicate, and that influences how and what they communicate, just as teacher-student or peer-to-peer will be different media, different relationships, and in the same way that, there's a kind of parallel. So we talk about medium and content, form and content, relationship and content. Of course, McLuhan especially defined all technology as media, and that's worth noting as well. So we mediate through the world, through any kind of technology as it comes between us. And for McLuhan, it was an extension. We extend ourselves, and he used that term. But whenever we extend ourselves, we're putting that medium or technology between ourselves and something else. And what comes between ourselves and something else becomes also our environment. It also shields us from our environment and becomes our environment. So it's all technology, but technology is not just, again, material substance, but also technique. That's the form part of it. So the alphabet is a technique. It's not tied to any one set of tools or materials. The assembly line is a technique. It doesn't require a conveyor belt. It could just use a fast food counter. So this includes technique, and ultimately we can look at this also as a kind of any kind of means or method, any way of doing something, any way that really comes down to the question of how we do things. The way that we do things influences what we do and what we end up with and who we become or who we are. And that really is a way of understanding McLuhan's famous aphorism that's sort of central to media ecology: the medium is the message. It's all about the way that we do things, and that comes down to, even so far as to look at it as a kind of dialectic, but not between binary oppositions, but an asymmetric dialectic between medium and content. So McLuhan observed that affluence, being rich, is the medium, and that out of which we get poverty. That is, you can't have poverty until you first have people with money. If everyone is poor, then no one's poor. But once you have some people who are rich, that in turn creates poverty. So in this sense, affluence is the medium, and poverty is its message. I say the same thing about life and death. There is no death unless there first is life. So life is the medium, and death is its message. I know that's creepy, but hey. Anyway, that's a bit more, perhaps a bit further on that you might need to go, but I did want to include that as part of our understanding, because it includes a lot of interesting ways of looking at things. So we're concerned with the medium. We also speak of the bias of the medium, that a medium has a bias, and this is not to be confused with the idea of bias as being prejudiced, favoritism. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about an incline, a slant, an inherent tendency that just as if you have a hill, things tend to go down the hill. They can go up the hill. You can go against the grain, but the tendency is for things to go down the hill. And that's the bias of the medium, that there is a tendency within the medium to be used in a certain way. That's to say, it's attributed to Mark Twain that when you have a hammer in your hand, everything else looks like a nail. Right? Hammers tend to be used in a certain way, and you can use them in other ways. I mean, you could try to use them to eat dinner with, but they are they have a tendency to be used in a certain way. This is true of materials itself. Stone is hard. That's inherent in the material of stone, and it influences what its tendencies are. So it's good for, for example, stones are good for being used as weapons. When you throw a stone, it's going to cause damage. So in this sense, all media, all technologies have a particular bias. They are never neutral. That is, kind of fundamental, I'd say, to media ecology. I've gone so far as to say if it's neutral, it's not technology. But bias is the connection between the medium and its effects. This is where the accusation of technological determinism comes in, which is really a misconception and a straw man argument, because it depends on a kind of mechanistic Newtonian cause and effect view of effects, which is not what we're talking about. It doesn't even apply in much of reality anymore. We're really talking about the effect of the environment on what is inside the environment. That's a downward causality, not two billiard balls, one hitting the other, but rather the effect of the table as constraining and influencing the behavior of the billiard balls. So reaching back to antiquity, and Marshall and Eric McLuhan, talked about this as formal causality rather than efficient causality. But this also relates to contemporary understandings of ecology, systems theory, the concept of emergence. That media technology as being environmental and create an environment out of which certain things emerge. It's not an absolute command, cause and effect, but rather creating the possibilities and the constraints that result in tendencies in one way or another. And so they result in an environment, different particular kinds of environments. And we very broadly will refer to four major types of environments in media ecology. There is, of course, the oral media environment. That's the environment out of which oral cultures emerge, which Walter Ong and Eric Havelock and Jack Goody have helped us to understand so well. That is just really the kind of baseline for human existence, having been our environment for tens of thousands of years. Then there's the chirographic media environment, which refers to the invention of writing. It's the most heterogeneous type of environment because it encompasses different kinds of writing systems, different kinds of writing surfaces, and scrolls, and codex, and illustrated manuscript, and so forth. But the key feature is a kind of scribal copying that's necessary to reproduce anything under those conditions. And then the typographic media environment, which we associate with Gutenberg, what McLuhan called the Gutenberg galaxy, and then the electronic media environment that we've been living in really fully took hold through television and now the internet and web and mobile technologies. And in a rough way, we talk about a kind of theory of history, if you like, in very broad strokes, looking at it. You can say that speech, language, orality is what makes us human. And this is the main distinction between us and other forms of life. And that systems of notation, especially means of keeping track of numbers, of quantity, and then moving into more qualitative distinctions of language, which really brings us ultimately into systems of writing, that kind of activity and that kind of media, those kind of media, are what are associated with the move from a kind of tribal culture to what we would traditionally call civilization, which is settlements, expanded populations, and more complex forms of social organization. And that exists in many different ways in many different places, but as we move from there into the invention of the alphabet, first the Semitic alphabet, and especially as utilized by the ancient Israelites or Hebrews, that gives us the basis of religion in the West, as well as the first form of narrative history, and with it the first full set of laws and ethical approach, and then that Semitic alphabet reaches Greece and is transformed into the Greek alphabet, and out of that we get philosophy, science, first sense of science. We get the theater. So out of that is the beginning of the literary tradition and democracy. And so we're really talking about the alphabet as the basis of Western civilization or Western culture. It's what defines that, the Western culture, and is why Western culture is distinct from, say, East Asian cultures. And so it's the Greco-Roman, kind of Hebreo-Greco-Roman culture that we're familiar with. And just jumping ahead, then we could say that printing, Gutenberg, is what brings us into the modern world. That before printing, what we have is medieval, the Renaissance era, the 1300s are essentially the medieval, and it's printing that creates modernity. It's often dated with Columbus, but Columbus didn't change much about everyday life for Europeans, but the printing press sure did. So that gives us the modern era, and now electronic media and its further evolution into digital formats is in many ways counter to the biases of the typographic era, and so we find ourselves in uncharted waters, a new era that some can only refer to as postmodern. And that's why media ecology is so important, because we need to understand these processes, understand these changes, and try to take some measure of control back from them. So again, I hope you read my book. I hope you got something out of this talk, and I wish you all very well in your studies, and maybe we'll see you one of these days at Media Ecology Association's annual meeting. Highly recommend those as well. Thank you very much.